your books marked to number 253.
Good evening, brother. Good to see you. Hey, we got some folks back tonight. Good to see you. I'm glad you were able to make it back. Others serving tonight in the worship service, Johnny Holman, of course, directing our singing. Jim Holman will have our opening prayer. And I'd like to ask, David Williams, would you mind having our closing prayer? Thank you, sir. Of course, I'll be doing the speaking at the proper time. So pleased to announce that Mary Kate Talley obeyed the gospel on Tuesday. Just so thankful for her and her decision to do that. Also, along those same lines, good news is Joe and Natalie Allen have a new grandbaby. His name is Cayman Allen Matthews, 6 pounds and 10 ounces. Also going on this week at the Vacation Bible School at Bridgeport, as well as the Kimball congregation. So I guess they did as good a scheduling as we did with Jasper, so they're having theirs the same time. I think you'd be edified at both places. I know that Bridgeport is going through the Apologetics Press material, and you'd probably be, if you're into evidences, that's the way that you'd want to go there. June the 29th will be our 5th Sunday dinner. And Group 3, you'll be in charge. Also, before you know it, Bible camp will be upon us. And looking forward to it. Look forward to it every year. But really looking forward to it. Our kids are getting bigger, and they're a lot of fun to watch. And we've got more going this year, I suppose, than I think that we ever have. And that's a great thing. Glad for that and glad for their participation. Mark your calendars and be mindful of the fact that Paula Talley will be having surgery Tuesday. She will be having surgery Tuesday. And it's supposed to be something that's going to keep her down for a while. So be remembering her and her family. I've already asked of things that we can do. I believe some folks have volunteered to help get her kids back into church. I thought that was really nice. But anything that, along those lines that we can do to help, be ready for that. Helen Stewart is with us tonight. So good to see her back. Ronnie's with her tonight from the big state of Texas. We're glad he's here. Also, Forrest Stewart is back home. And Joe said that I would have to write her and Forrest a pass this week. They just didn't think they could get out. And I told them, well, I thought I could give them a few more passes if they needed it. She said they didn't think they'd need it, but we'll see. His attitude's been really great. He's doing real well, and we're glad that he's back home. Joe said her bed, first time she'd been in it in a long time, last night said it felt great. We're glad for her. Barbara Payne, the mother of Dilly Russell, Deanne Day, Gene Cooper, just 3 of our members here, is pretty much in renal failure. She's had another stroke. She's just in a really bad way, and they don't even want to leave her alone at this time. And so Deanne called me right before services. Remember that family. Also, Doris Herring, who is the sister of Helen Holman, is been diagnosed. They know that she has cancer, but they don't know all the details. And Helen will probably be leaving us for a short time. And so we'll miss her, but know she's going to do a great work. Doris's husband is going to be having surgery during that time too. So they're both going to be needing some help there. And so glad that she's willing to do that. And so good to have people in your family who are concerned enough and love you enough that they can take the time. Appreciate Jim, because I know if he, for letting Helen go, because he'll probably eat a lot of bologna sandwiches and stuff while she's gone. But we're glad that for him and her. I see several of our folks back now. We're glad you're here and glad you had a safe trip. Hope you had an enjoyable time. This time I'll ask Jim if he would to have our opening prayer.
253. Will your anchor hold in the storm? 275. 275.
Good evening, brethren. Good to see everybody. Good to see so many of you that have returned home. Glad you had a safe trip. Hope it was enjoyable. Hope it wasn't too hot for you. You look awful good to somebody that's been out in the heat all day. But if you would be opening your Bibles up to Zechariah, the 7th chapter. Zechariah, the 7th chapter. We've been looking at the book. We said the first 6 verses basically there is a kind of a reproach. Zechariah is getting after the people to repent. And then we looked very quickly at the 6 evening visions, we call them, beginning in verse 7 and going through the middle of chapter 6. And at the end of chapter 6, we looked at the coronation of that king that was to come. And of course, we determined that that king is not a fleshly king that would sit on a literal throne in Jerusalem. But in order for that king to sit on his throne, he would have to be both priest and king. So we decided and showed from the scriptures that must be talking about the Christ and that he is ruling and reigning today on his throne. Showed many passages from the New Testament in which that is the very thing that is said. So with that in mind, let's look at chapter 7. Completely different now. We're almost 4 years removed from the visions that we have seen. Now, we should not take the fact that there's a 4-year gap to think that Zechariah has not been preaching, that he hasn't been teaching. We just don't have that part written down. Have you ever thought about how much work the apostles did that we don't have record of? You know, if you look at the first, 10 chapters of the book of Acts, it's pretty much the Peter show. We have recorded pretty much the events of his life and his preaching. But after that, pretty much the Apostle Paul is the one that's looked at the most. We have a couple of the apostles mentioned, but these men spent their lives preaching the gospel of Christ, and yet we have no record of it. So we shouldn't be surprised that we find gaps from time to time. In the prophets, God has given us all things to pertain unto life and godliness, and he has chosen to give us these parts so that we can go back and look at them. Of course, we looked at the visions. The reason we wanted to do all of this is we're on our way to the apocalyptic literature of Ezekiel and the Revelation, and we just thought it'd be a good thing to look at these texts that use that same kind of language so that we would see that this is something that the Jews were pretty familiar with, and it wasn't as, odd to them as it is to us nowadays when we open up and look at it. So we're in chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a complete different topic, 4 years removed. You've got some fellows who have come down from another town, and they are questioning about some feasts that the Jews were keeping. Now, do you remember your studies and the book of Esther? As a matter of fact, if you'll remember, we spent an entire quarter in the adult class, last year, I think, on the book of Ruth and Esther. I mean, that was almost a chapter, a week for both books. It was an interesting study. I'm glad we did it, but I thought that was, in Esther, there's just kind of like the story. I mean, that's pretty much it. But do you remember the Jews, they set up a holiday as a result of that. It's even on your calendars today for the most part. You'll see the Feast of Purim. And Purim is the idea of casting lots. And so that was a feast day that they came up with, a commemoration, if you will. In our country, we have set aside various days as well. Some of those have just went by. Memorial Day is a day that we have set aside as a nation saying, hey, listen, we're going to get on our jet skis and our motorboats and go out and cook and camp. Well, that's not what it was set up for. It was set up so that we would take time to memorialize, to remember those who have given their lives for this country. We think of Veterans Day when we celebrate the lives and are thankful for our veterans. Those are holidays that we as Americans have set aside along with holidays such as the 4th of July that commemorate an event in this country. The Jews had done the same thing. And before we kind of get after them saying they're adding to the word or taking away from the word, you have to remember they were in a peculiar situation. They are governed by what is called a theocracy. We have a democracy. Basically what we have is a representative republic where, we vote people and they go up and they talk about representative democracy, talk about how, their constituents, well, that's what they're supposed to do, would like to do the things. And so that's the kind of government we have. We don't have a monarch like, the King of England or the Queen of England years ago. but but what they had is a theocracy. And what you had was God was their king, if you will, and he set up, and so they had this law that ran parallel, or was, their governmental law as well. Even when the king was established, he was supposed to go by the old law. Remember the blessings that God said he would give to the king, as he would, keep his word and so forth. So that's what they had. So before we say, well, they didn't even have authority for that, just look at the situation. They were not only a nation of people that had things that came up in their lives, but they were also the kingdom of God. Now, the only feast or fast day. Now, fasting is basically when you say, okay, I'm not going to eat. And you can see that I'm not real good at that. I'm trying to get better, but I am not good at that. But fasting was when you'd say, I'm going to not have food. Now, everybody knows you have to have food to live. You have to have food and water. And so basically the custom is from when the sun comes out, you're going to try to eat as little and drink as little as possible until the sun goes down, and then you can eat more. That's why when you see the month of Ramadan, now they take a whole month, the Muslims do, and they fast. You're going like, how do they even live for a month? Well, they don't really not eat. They just don't eat when the sun is up. Okay, when it goes down, you can pretty much, you're supposed to stay, not eating, but, to a certain degree, eat less. But a lot of them don't look at that. The Jews had 4 in particular feasts that they had kind of come up with on their own. The 4th month, they celebrated the coming of the the Babylonian armies. I've been studying Revelation so much, I've got the Roman armies on the brain. But they celebrated, they fasted. It was a very bad thing. Fasting was something when you were sad. Sometimes you would put sackcloth on, which is a real garment that was just real itchy. It was not something that you would want to wear, but it was what you did when you fasted, when you mourned. You would put ashes in your hair, dirt on your body, in other words, and you would let everybody see that, and you would abstain from food, and this is the idea of fasting and mourning. Now, they set one up in the 4th month of the year, and they did that because that's when the Babylonian armies surrounded Jerusalem. They also had a feast for the 5th month for the burning of the temple. And I'm sorry, the 4th month, that is totally wrong. The 4th month was the breaching of the wall, the breaching of the Jerusalem wall. The 10th month, they had a fast. I keep getting those confused. A fast, because that's when the Babylonian army came. The feast of the 4th month was the breach of the wall. The feast of the 5th month, I'm saying feast again. The fast of the 5th month was for the burning of the temple. And then for the 7th month is when the Chaldeans were pretty much going to leave Jerusalem, alone. They had taken everything they were going to, and they had put up a governor. His name was Gedaliah. And I always say that wrong unless it's right in front of me. And we'll look at that here in just a moment. But some wicked men took and slew that man. He was a good man. He was trying to do, in a bad situation, he was going to be the leader, the governor, if you will, of the people of Israel in the stead of the Babylonians, but they murdered him. And so in the 7th month you had that feast. With all that information, let's try to look at the text now. And it came to pass in the 4th year of King Darius. Now, you remember in chapter 1, we began that one in the 1st year, so it's been 4 years, that the word of the Lord came unto Zechariah in the 4th day of the 9th month, even in Chisleu. Now, Chisleu is a Jewish month, and it is the same time as our November, December. And that's why when you see a Jewish month, it would probably run from the 15th of our month to the 15th of the next month. So you get 2 months every time you get a Jewish month. They'll say it's not like it's 60 days long. It just happens to start out in the middle of our months. That's why every time you see a Jewish month, it'll say it's equal to, it always gives us 2 months because they break down. This is when he gets his revelation, verse 2. And when they had sent unto the house of God, now this is where the King James will differ from the King James. The King James will differ from the American Standard Version. And it's because the word Bethel. The word Bethel literally means house of God. Beth, house, El, God. And so you put the two together and you have house of God. Well, the King James translator says, we're not messing with it. We're going to call it, we're going to call it the house of God. And the American Standard Version says, yeah, but if you're going to look at this in the vernacular that we speak, it makes more sense to translate this as men came down from Bethel, because that's what happened. You got some folks coming from another place. And you think about the house of God, you think of the temple, right? And so what's being built in Jerusalem is the house of God in the Old Testament. They're going to build God's house there in Jerusalem. That's what this whole book is about. Rebuild the temple. And that's why we had those 8 visions saying, hey, I'm going to be with you, rebuild the temple. And Zechariah was after the people, rebuild the temple. And so that's the house of God. Well, here these men come from the house of God. Well, they didn't leave from Jerusalem to come to Jerusalem. They came probably, and I think rightfully so, from Bethel. So that's just something that a little, there you have. And it's one of the reasons I love the King James Version now. They have literally Beth-el. And they're saying that means house of God. And so instead of telling you that's Bethel and just transliterating it, they're saying, hey, listen, you figured that out for yourself. There's the word. Run with it. I appreciate that. I had the good pleasure of talking to Ed Troxell's grandson this morning for a little while after church. Poor fella, I got him in all kind of trouble. They left him here with me, and who wants that to happen? But anyway, I got to spend a good amount of time with him, and we were talking about various things along those lines, and got to talking about our Bibles. And I tried to explain to him, and I'll try to explain to you, that there's a certain beauty to the King James Version. I wouldn't ever try to deny that. I realize the readability and the understandability may not be as good. Well, it's just definitely not as good in today's vernacular as the American Standard, English Standard, or the New King James Version. But I've always been a King James fella. But I was thinking at one time about, maybe it's time to go on as people are progressing and nobody's really speaking this, thou, and so forth. But as I took the Hebrew, and I've got about 2.5 years of Greek, and I've got about a year of Hebrew, a little over a year now, I just keep coming back to the fact these men were trying to be as consistent as they could. And they were very, what I would call, conservative with the text. They were not going to tell you what they think the text means. They're going to give you the word. There it is. It's yours, run with it. Now I know we can find them inconsistent in some places. For instance, the word baptism. To be consistent with that, they should have translated that. They should have translated it and not transliterated it. So it has its faults. So I'm not going to knock it. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to leave the King James. I guess I'm going to die with it. I've really enjoyed it all these years. But I'm not knocking you now if you use an American Standard or a New King James or an English Standard. Some of the newer translations can be dangerous. But just that in mind, you can see where both these translations, the American Standard Version and the King James Version, were doing their double dog best to give you what the word meant. And the King James Version says, we're not even going to fool with it. We're going to leave it just like it is, house of God. Now notice these two fellas. You have a Sherezer and a Regem Melech. And they're men. They came with a cohort, if you will, of men to pray before the Lord and to speak unto the priests which were in the house of the Lord of hosts, and to the prophets. They've got a question. They've come down and said, should I weep in the 5th month, separating myself? Now, this is one man asking, but obviously he is speaking for the group. Should we separate ourselves, wear the sackcloth and ashes, put on the, fast, don't eat? Should we do that like we have done all these years? Now, it's a pretty good question, because they have really turned this up a notch. They've been in captivity for 70 years, and this has been some of the memorial things they've looked at to remind them of their heritage, to remind them of the fact they're supposed to be, in Jerusalem, and that God had taken them there to punish them. So these are reminder things, and now they're going back, they're rebuilding the temple, and so this is a really great question. If you remember, the tabernacle at one time was in Bethel, and so here these fellows come down. It's a good little hall now. They come down, and also remember that's where one of the calves were set up for idolatry worship by the very first king, Jeroboam. They come down, they ask questions. Should we continue to do that? Because now here's the temple. They wanted to be right, okay? They simply wanted to be right. And so they're saying, is this what we should do? They come to the head shed, if you will, to where the temple's going to be, to the priests and the prophets that are there. Zechariah has been working there. Malachi, probably. Also Haggai. These are prophets of God. They know these men are men of God. You've got the Levites there. They come asking, should we continue to do this? In verse 4, then came the word of the Lord of hosts unto me. You are going to see that over and over, and I don't mind it a whole lot, since how I know a little bit of the original now, because when my teacher would say, hey, translate this passage, I could go, okay, Ko Amar Adonai, I know that. I can translate that. Thus saith the Lord. And you're going to see it over and over again. Because Zechariah doesn't want for 1 minute do you think that he's just coming up with this off the cuff. He's saying, God has spoken to me, and this is what he has said. Speak unto all the people of the land and to the priests, saying, When you fasted in the 5th month, fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th month, even those 70 years, did ye at all fast unto me, even to me? Now basically what God is sitting there, he's asking them, was that really about me? You think now, brethren, and I'm not knocking folks that want to go take that extra day and go do something, but when we set aside the holidays in the United States, Memorial Day and things of that nature, you know, how many of us actually stop and reflect upon, I know a great many of you do, not knocking it if you don't, it's not something you have to do, but that's what the day was set for. It was set aside to do this particular thing. Well, a lot of people just celebrate the holiday. They go, woohoo, you know, I don't have to go to work Monday. This will be great. We can go out on the lake, or we can go fishing, or we can take a 3-day trip somewhere. They don't look at it all about the holiday. That's exactly what God is asking here. He's saying, when you were fasting and weeping, was this something you was really doing for me, or were you just taking advantage of a holiday and just joining in with everybody just to be doing what everybody else is doing? Was this to me, even to me? And then in verse 6, and when you did eat, and when you did drink, did not ye eat for yourselves and drink for yourselves? You see, these had gone into kind of a holiday, if you will. Verse 7, should you not hear the words which the Lord hath cried by the former prophets? Now, this is just going to back up and reiterate what had been said before. He said, have you not listened to what the former prophets, when Jerusalem was inhabited, in prosperity, and the cities thereof round about her, when men inhabited the south and the plain? He said the whole reason that you were having to go through those fasts, the whole reason that you had set aside those days was because you had not paid attention to what I had told you before. You had rebelled against me. You would not keep my word. You had blood on your hands. You were sinful. And so I took you into Babylon to purge you. He says that was the whole problem. You didn't listen to the prophets then, and you're having a hard time doing it now. So basically what you have there is a rebuke. Notice in verse 8, and the word of the Lord came unto Zechariah, saying, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, execute true judgment. God is going to tell Israel what you need to do. An interesting footnote there in verse 9. This thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, I believe the American Standard may change this a little bit. It's not annotated on mine. But basically what you have here is a call perfect. That's a Hebrew term for the particular verb that is used. And what that is saying is this is something that's taking place. In other words, quoting what God has said before. God has said. So this is not something new. This is something that God had said to the people many times before. Listen what he says. Execute true judgment. Show mercy and compassion every man to his brother. You see, that's the hard things of Christianity. That was the hard things for the Jews. Why, when they weren't in the temple worshiping God, they were outside taking advantage of each other, extorting money from each other, doing everything they could to get ahead in this world. And they didn't think about the widow. They didn't think about the fatherless. And then they would go into the temple and they would try to act like what a good person of God they were. When the whole time the law of God had said, be good to your fellow man. Love your neighbors. Do well unto them. You find a man's animal that's roaming around in your field. You don't keep it. You don't shoot it and eat it. You take it back to him, even if it's your enemy. Even if your enemy's animal with a burden is coming through and collapses, you don't let that animal lay there. You fix that. And it's something that they should have picked up on. Along those same lines about pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, James 1:27. Turn with me, if you will, to the book of Micah. To the book of Micah. Oh, you got to be careful on these little bitty prophets, man, because you'll zip right by them. They're as bad as Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians in the New Testament. But let's turn over to Micah, and let's look at chapter 6 at verse 6. Micah 6 at verse 6. Notice there's a new thought here. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord? Now here's Israel, years before now, talking to God. They want to know, how should I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and with calves of a year old? Is that what God wants? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams or with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? What's it take to please you, God? In other words, they're like, man, we've been doing this for years. What in the world do you want? You know, what's it going to take to please you? I have to give you my children? I have to sacrifice them on the altar? And Micah rebukes them. God rebukes them. He says, he hath showed thee, O man, what is good. It doesn't take all that fanatical kind of stuff. What doth the Lord require of thee? What is it? Do justly. You treat people fairly. Love mercy. Be kind to people. And to walk humbly with thy God. You see, this was not new information. Micah had recorded this several hundred years earlier. Had the Jews picked up on it? No. They continued to do exactly what they were doing. And now they're coming to God and they're asking these prophets, well, should we keep these fasts that we have been, commemorating the fall of Jerusalem? God's saying, you didn't keep the ones I had before. You weren't doing what I told you before. Listen to what I told you before. Verse 10 of Zechariah. We're back in Zechariah 7. Oppress not the widow. Have you heard that before? Well, I tell you what, if you read your Old Testament, you will hear that over and over again. If you read your New Testament, you will hear it. God has always been concerned with widows and with children. I'll tell you something else. That's one of the reasons I think America still stands today. I know we're running headlong into every kind of wickedness that you can think of. But I tell you, one thing we do well in this country is that we take care of the fatherless and we take care of widows. Now, one of the things I think we have done in our great zeal to take care of widows and fatherless, and I'm not saying that is wrong at all, but we've got to be careful because we've created an entire generation that thinks, well, hey, it's better off to be fatherless. And so the fathers don't bother to stay around, and the mothers are benefiting from the fact that their children are fatherless. You have to be careful. You don't want people to read into good things to take care of the fatherless and the widows. But you don't want to develop a society that says, well, that's how we ought to do it. We can get a tax break. This is better for us. Let's do this. Let's don't get married. Let's just have children, and then we'll have these entitlements, coming from the government. We don't need to encourage that. And the way that we do that, our government shouldn't have to police that up for us. We as a people should be able to police that up ourselves and encourage our children to do that which is right, to marry those whom they have relations with, to be the father, to be a mother, and have the family as God would have it. Oppress not the widow, nor the fatherless, over and over again. The stranger, nor the poor, and let none of you imagine evil against his brother in your heart. That's one of the things Chase said to me this morning. I was very impressed, that young man. He's got a head on his shoulders. And he said, in this country, we just don't have want. And he's right. If there's people hungry, it's because they just haven't knocked on the right door or haven't went to the right place. We have huge umbrellas to catch folks. Our country, people think it's a right to have a cell phone. They think it's important to have an iPod. That if you don't have that, you're not what you ought to be. It's just absolutely amazing to me. We don't have poverty like the rest of the world has it, yet I tell you, we have a population in our country that screams all the time about all the social injustice. And most of them are all driving cars better than anything we had when I was growing up. I remember sometimes my parents would want to go visit my stepdad's people over in Shelbyville, and I didn't want to go. Because we didn't have a car to run that well. And so I remember every time you left the house, you left, and seriously, it was faith. And a lot of times your faith won't carry you through, especially when the water pump goes out or something of that nature. It's just, it's amazing how things have changed. We don't really have the problem of severe poverty that, Micah and the prophets of the Old Testament, Zechariah, are dealing with. These are people that will die if you don't give them something to eat. They are that dead. I'm talking about in the next few days. They're destitute. They have nothing. They literally live hand to mouth. God is saying, take care of that. Remember the poor, and let none of you imagine evil against his brother in your heart. Clean up your minds. But they refused to hearken and pulled away the shoulder. In other words, and look here, and stopped their ears. When I read that, what's the first thing that pops in your mind? When you see them stopping up their ears, taking their hand. My grandson, for one, but that's how he doesn't listen to you. He throws his hands up. But in Acts 7, do you remember? When Stephen's really getting on them. He says, ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised heart and ears, your fathers and you always refused the Spirit of God. They were so angry at him, they closed up their ears, and they ran to him, attacked him, of course, killed him, would stone him to death. That's what I think of. But notice this, they refused to hearken and pulled away the shoulder. You ever heard the term of the cold shoulder? You ever gotten one of those? I've gotten a lot of those. But I'll tell you what jumps in my mind when I see that. They took away the shoulder. There is a Greek word in the Bible that I just absolutely love. I love the word picture of it. It's called parakaleo. It's used like all the time. And it literally has the idea, para beside, kaleo, to talk. It literally has the idea of putting your arm around somebody and walking with them, encouraging them, uplifting them to do whatever it is. If they're sad, you're trying to encourage them to be happy, or, to comfort them in some way. Parakaleo, beautiful term. That's the idea that you see here. Of course, this is Hebrew. This is not Greek. But you have God. He was trying to take them by the shoulder and encourage them to do what's right, but what they do? They'd pull away. They didn't want to hear what God had to say. They were rebellious and stiff-necked. Nothing has really changed in that time. And notice that they should not hear. And notice verse 12. Yea, they made their hearts as an adamant stone. Not only a stone, but I'm talking about a serious stone. A stone that can't be penetrated. And brethren, think about this with me for a moment. As I was putting this together and looking at this chapter, how does your heart get hard? Do people outside harden your heart? Where does the hardness come from? Same place the heart is. It's from inside. Now, I know that we can have influences outside of us that give us so much grief and things of that nature that encourage us to, build up walls and harden our hearts and so forth. I'm not denying that for a moment, but we do it. We do it to ourselves. We harden our own hearts. And here Israel had hardened their heart to so much that God would say, not only is that a rock, but it's a serious rock, an adamant stone, lest they should hear the law. Now, we're not talking about the law, like Drive 55 or something of this nature, even though that would be applicable. But the law of God, His commandments to treat men well, to love your wives. Malachi, one of the things he'll hop on here in about 40 years after Zechariah is he'll say, don't put away the wife of your youth. They still didn't have that right. They were still mistreating their women. They were mistreating their families. And this is what this is all about. They're hard-hearted. They think they can do whatever they want to. They won't listen to the law of God. When God says He made them a man and a woman, and the two should come together, and that should be the basis for the home, the Jew was saying that's not enough. And later on, I'm going to want a new woman because I want to do things that will satisfy my eyes and my desires. And they were just totally casting aside the law of God and the words which the Lord of hosts hath sent in His Spirit by the former prophets, the Elijahs, the Elishas, the non-writing prophets, the prophets that we can read, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Those men, they just put them aside. Therefore came a great wrath from the Lord of hosts. These guys are living proof of it. The ones that are hearing this message, they know all about that. That's why they're there. That's why they're standing there in rubble, or at least heavy-duty construction going on, because what used to be there is no longer there, because God says, you're going to listen to me. You're going to listen to me. If it's the last thing you and your nation do, you're going to listen to what I have to say. I've got a job for you to do. I need you to bring forth the Christ. I've prophesied that's how it's going to be. You folks are going to do that. You're going to listen to me. And one of the ways I'm going to make sure you do that is I'm going to carry you away 1,200 miles into a nation that doesn't speak your language. You'll have no idea what they're saying. And you wanted pagan gods? I'm going to give you pagan gods. There's going to be one on every corner. You won't be able to turn around in a place without seeing a pagan god. You'll have pagan gods coming out your nose. You're going to listen to me. And they could read this and say the wrath of God and go, yeah, we know all about that. Verse 13, therefore it came to pass that as he cried and they would not hear, so they cried, and now what's God done? He's closed up His ears. He's saying, when I talked to you, when I sent my prophets, most of them you killed and you stoned. You wouldn't listen to them. You wouldn't listen to them. I'm not going to listen to you now. And I would not hear, saith the Lord of hosts. Notice verse 14. But I scattered them with the whirlwind. Kind of reminds you of Hosea, don't it? They sowed the wind, and what happened? They reaped the whirlwind. You know, we reap what we sow. Galatians 6, verses 8 and 9. God is not mocked, which means literally to look down the nose at. God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that will he also reap. That is a universal principle in spiritual matters as well as physical matters. If you sow to the Spirit, you will of the Spirit reap life everlasting. But if you sow to the flesh, you are going to reap the benefits of that as well, which is death. He said, I scattered them with a whirlwind among all the nations whom they knew not. You know how the Jews, they didn't even like to eat with other people. God had told them there were certain things to be a people that didn't run around with the pagans and so forth. Don't make covenants with them. They'll lead you off into paganism, things of that nature. I want you to be a separate people. Well, they cranked that up a notch, said, we won't even have anything to do with them. We won't even eat with them. And so they really isolated themselves, and then lo and behold, God takes them and throws them into a land where they're in the midst of everybody. They're slaves. They're actually having to go into other people's homes and serve them. That would have been a mighty lesson to have to learn. A whirlwind among all the nations whom they knew not. Thus saith the land was desolate. Thus the land was desolate after them, that no man passed through nor returned, for they laid the pleasant land desolate. Everybody knew that's what took place, and that's exactly what took place. Next week, we're going to look at chapter 8, when God has said, okay, that's over. And he's going to give what we call the 10 oracles, the 10 short oracles. They begin in verse 2 there and go through the end of the chapter, where God is going to say and encourage them to indeed continue on what they've done, that he is on their side, that this is the remnant, and that he is going to bless them. If you're here tonight and you're not a child of God, well, you need to fix that. Looks like that. I think just about everybody here is. That's the thing about on Sunday nights. Usually just about everybody in the audience is a Christian. If not, they're too young or they're thinking about it. Maybe you've been thinking about it. Let me encourage you. Anytime's a good time to do and to make the greatest decision you'll ever make in your life, the decision of which you will never, ever regret. I say that with 100% confidence. You'll never regret the day that you obeyed the gospel of Christ. As a matter of fact, it'll be one of the highlights of your days. But sometimes we as Christians, we can find ourselves growing indifferent, and it can happen very quickly. If you look at the churches in Revelation there, chapter 2 and 3, hadn't been around long, and many of them had already gotten kind of complacent. Many of them had got to kind of a didn't really care attitude. If we're not careful, we can develop that attitude. That's why we try to teach lessons. We try to encourage each other. We try to sing songs that'll exhort one another to do that which is right, to encourage each other because, hey, guys, we got a long way to go. Some of us got a longer way than others. Some of us are getting closer to the end, but this is a race. It's not a race to the swift, but it's a race to the faithful. It is a race, a marathon, if you will. And we've got to encourage each other along the way to, hey, let's continue through and let's make it all the way home. So if you're here tonight as a New Testament member, a New Testament church member, Body of Christ member, but you've left your first love, well, you don't have to do all the things that a person that's coming out of the world needs to do. You don't need to be rebaptized, but you do need to confess that sin. If it's something of a personal nature, then just simply go to prayer to God and ask him to forgive you. Put him back where he needs to be. If it's something of a public nature now, and you need to make that right, then I would encourage you to make it public. But don't leave this building not right with God. If you need to obey the gospel or just come back home, we encourage you. If we can help you in any way, would you come as together we stand and sing?